We welcome all the students who are gathered here for the first non-invasive brain stimulation class from Indians. This is the second class which we are taking for both MD and DNB. The first one was on forensic psychiatry, and this is a series of lectures on NIBS. Dr. B.N. Gangadhar, who is the beloved director of NIMHANS, will be speaking now. Over to you, sir.
So welcome. We're going to take you through learning the non-invasive brain stimulations. And first among them has been the electroconvulsive therapy. Electroconvulsive therapy is something that you may already have been using in your clinical practice, in your PG training, in the hospitals where you are working. However, there have been several advances. There are several critical issues which you need to be aware of. It is by far the oldest treatments in psychiatry which is currently used, although its contemporaries, a couple of them, even after receiving the Nobel Prize, have been dropped from clinical practice. For example, the malaria therapy of 1913 and the psychosurgery that came around the same time as the ECT, and a few more treatment that came along with ECT like insulin shock treatment, etc., have all become history, but ECT still survives and is going strong, but of course with a lot of improvements, refinements, and also of course controversies. Observation that epileptic attacks reduce psychotic symptoms prompted an Hungarian psychiatrist to induce seizures using chemicals. And he was able to obtain a predictable seizure, and the seizures got these people better. However, there were several challenges which made people to search for some procedure which will induce seizure more promptly. Electricity-induced seizure was the answer. Began in 1930. Initiated further introduction. ECT which gave any seizure response without anesthesia. Much later, anesthesia was introduced, and then people realized that ECT was effective in improving several conditions. However, they had to conduct clinical trials. A series of clinical trials happened in depression particularly, and they found that ECT performed much better than antidepressant drugs. The ECT also was as good for people who were receiving antipsychotic drugs when they had any exacerbations or catatonic symptoms and so on. Subsequently, the range of conditions for which ECT has been put to use have been slowly coming down. However, those who are not getting better with our conventional treatments have been experimented on by using ECT. For example, the neuroleptic malignant syndrome, difficult cases of obsessive compulsive disorder, and some of the conditions which occur with neurological illnesses as well have been, for example, depression in Parkinson's disease. These are all the conditions on which ECT has been attempted, and people have found some benefit in this. But what changed the way in which we started using ECT is the change of the stimulus from what we were earlier using, the sine wave, which today, of course, none of you may be using it, the brief pulse constant current stimulus, the highly controlled, highly significant way in which the stimulus is administered. Along with that, it is enough that we give a stimulus and give anesthesia and get a seizure. can we record this using EEG? And we realized over course of time, people who were going for ECT were all those patients are not very well tolerated, and ECT is often chosen as an alternative. And so what happens when people are using ECT in populations which are medically compromised? What are all the things that we need to do? Monitor the ECG, monitor the blood oxygenation concentration using oximeter, and a host of those things, and a series of medical evaluations that have to happen, and more so because we started using anesthesia for modification. Modified ECT required even more stringent clinical examination. And then came the human rights movement. Should ECT be given at all? And if ECT has to be given, what is the consent procedures? Should ECT be given to people who have compromised in decision-making capacity? What are the challenges in them? More so in those who are age group of 18 and below, where in the juvenile age group, their competence to understand the consequences of taking or not taking ECT is again need to be considered. So the Mental Health Care Act paid a specific attention to ECT, and today you know that we have to give only modified ECT. We cannot give unmodified ECT. Although majority of the hospitals are using the modified ECT, but the law makes it a point that all should use modified ECT, and children who have to receive ECT need to be given a special attention. More people have to be involved in the decision-making process. Consent has to be taken only after 2 or more psychiatrists concur ECT is the treatment of choice in these patients. So together, ECT has moved from the days when we gave treatment with unmodulated electric current from the mains without anesthesia to people who had not been exposed to any other formal treatments like antipsychotics or antidepressants. And having seen the success, advances has persisted and has made strides day by day with refinements, and has come and stayed with psychiatric practice. You may probably also notice that more and more societies or psychiatric bodies have included guidelines for ECT, whether in the Royal College of Psychiatry, the American Psychiatric Association. We have seen a couple of what we call as associations of convulsive therapy or associations for non-invasive brain stimulation have come. Convulsive therapy are now called general VCT, and also the brain journals also come in place to receive research articles and publish them, and to make this whole process of non-invasive brain stimulation, ECT in particular, be a very professional and a scientific way in which we are going to use it on psychiatric patients. So here we are. I welcome each one of you to this class, a digital class. We have Professor Jagadisha Tirthahalli, who has had an extensive experience on using ECT, won several awards presenting ECT papers, written close to 100 papers on ECT in different journals, including some textbook chapters. So he'll be with you for this first class on ECT. I welcome all of you to participate in this class. Dr. Jagadisha.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Jagadisha is going to use slides for training. Yeah, Jagadisha.
Yeah. Good afternoon to all of you. This is the first class on ECT. We have 3 classes. In the first class, I will be talking about basics and the procedure of ECT. In the next class, Dr. P.C. Sinha will be talking about mechanism of action of ECT, and then about evidence-based practice and indications for ECT. And in the final class, our postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Sachin Baliga, will be talking to you about how to use ECT in medically compromised and other special populations. Dr. BNG has already spoken to you briefly about the history. It is important that we know history before we understand the current practice. So I'll quickly go through the history of ECT, procedure of ECT, electrical aspects. This is generally been not taught formally in most medical colleges, so you may find this useful. And then there will be talking about some common adverse effects and how to monitor cognitive adverse effects. Coming to brief history, as Dr. BNG was telling you, from many centuries, people have noticed that there is an inverse relationship between seizures and psychosis. Particularly in people with epileptic psychosis, they used to observe that when the EEG becomes normal and the seizures are better controlled, the person's psychosis and behavioral problems increase. This phenomenon was called as forced normalization. As soon as there was a seizure, the person's behavior and psychosis would come down. This was carefully noted by many people, and they started thinking, why not we produce seizures to control psychosis? So they used many chemicals like cardiazol, metrazole, camphor, etc. But getting seizures was a little unpredictable, and controlling the seizure was difficult with these chemicals. And hence, people thought, why don't we use electricity? So Serletti and Binney in 1938 used electricity for the first time to treat a person probably with psychosis and found dramatic improvement in him. In a lighter vein, I would say that if you have a person with agitated depression or psychotic depression, you can give them CBT, that is Serletti and Binney treatment. So it is the longest surviving somatic treatment in psychiatry. No other somatic treatment has stood the test of time. In the 1940s to 60s, the focus was on efficacy, establishing whether ECT works in different conditions, particularly depression and schizophrenia. Subsequent research focused on safety. First came the anesthesia. So we started providing ECT with anesthesia, the so-called modified ECT. Then a lot of focus was on cognitive safety. That is by changing the stimulus waveform, electrode placements, and frequency of sessions. By modifying some of these, safety, cognitive safety of ECT was improved. So you may say that about 3/4 of ECT research in terms of clinical research has focused on improving cognitive safety, and I think the in terms of its efficacy, particularly in depression, is very well established. Let's briefly go through the ECT procedure. The most important ingredient of ECT is the seizure. It is a necessary ingredient, but not sufficient. What I mean by that is that, take for example, right unilateral ECT. If you provide unilateral ECT at a threshold level of stimulus, it will produce seizure, but it will not have an antidepressant effect. It's equivalent to giving sham ECT. That is, right unilateral ECT at a threshold level is almost equal to sham ECT. So their seizure is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So we need to produce seizures. But what happens if you produce seizures without muscle relaxant? It looks barbaric, and it can cause musculoskeletal injuries. And of course, now it is unlawful to provide ECT without muscle relaxant under the Mental Health Care Act. So you need to give a muscle relaxant. What happens if you give muscle relaxation without any sedation? It can be a dreadful experience. Imagine yourself very wide awake and your breathing has completely stopped. You cannot move a muscle of your body. So it can be very difficult. So when that happens, to avoid that, we need to have anesthetic agent. So here we have to give an anesthetic agent, relax the muscles, and then give electricity to produce a seizure. So we need to do some pre-procedure assessment, thorough medical history. It is extremely important to take diligent history to rule in or rule out medical comorbidities. Specific attention to two aspects in ECT. One, please look for any contraindications for the use of succinylcholine and look for signs of raised intracranial tension. Of course, you need to look at many other medical conditions, but these two are very specific to ECT. I will come to these two a little later. Now, succinylcholine is the most commonly used drug, so you need to be cautious about using it in people who have suspected pseudocholinesterase deficiencies. There are certain communities which are genetically predisposed to have prolonged effects of succinylcholine because of pseudocholinesterase deficiency. So particularly in South India, there is a community called Vaisya community which seems to have this in a genetic predisposition. So if they are from that community, we need to be careful before we inject them with succinylcholine. In conditions which can cause hyperkalemia, psychiatrists come across these in suicide attempts with burns or prolonged immobilization can cause hyperkalemia. And if you give succinylcholine in a person who is already hyperkalemic, it can lead to further hyperkalemic problems. Organophosphorus component poisoning again is if a person has attempted suicide by using this, and if you post him for ECT, be careful that his pseudocholinesterase may be lower and he may have prolonged apnea. So these are some of the things only careful history taking can help you with. And look for raised intracranial tension like headache, vomiting, especially headache that wakes up a person in the morning and person has projectile vomiting because of headache. This can give you some sense of raised intracranial tension. Of course, there is examination. In addition to looking for vital parameters, you need to be careful about respiratory system examination to look for rhonchi and crepitations. Your anesthesia colleagues will be very finicky about people having these problems. They will find that these are not worth the risk unless the ECT is extremely urgent. You should of course do fundoscopy to rule out papilledema. If you are not confident and if it's suspect raised intracranial tension, go for imaging. The lab tests that you need to be doing are hemogram, blood sugar, fasting, electrolytes, and ECG. There is no need for routine brain imaging or chest X-ray. You may have to do further lab tests based on the person's medical conditions, and these will be covered in a later class. On the morning of the ECT day, ideally the person should be fasting overnight. Clear fluids in sips may be taken about 2 hours prior to ECT. If a person has to take some tablets that he has to take, again, that will be covered in another class. He can take that with sips of water. The scalp should be dry and clean. This is important because if there is oil or sweat, the electricity between the two electrodes of ECT may pass through the skin rather than the skull. The skull provides more resistance, and as you know, electricity takes the path of the least resistance. So you may end up having shorting. It may not hurt the person, but the person will not get seizures. Particularly if you are giving right unilateral ECTs where the electrodes are closely placed, and if there is sweat or oil, that may lead to shorting of the circuit and lack of seizures. Be careful to remove the valuables, dentures, hearing aid, contact lenses, etc. Make sure that the nurse has taken care of these things. Encourage the person to empty bladder because there are case reports of bladder rupture during seizures. Secure an IV line after you confirm the identity of the patient. Then connect EEG, ECG, non-invasive blood pressure monitoring, pulse oximeter, and the blood pressure cuff, BP cuff on the right forearm or leg. This is to monitor the muscle motor seizures. As you are going to give succinylcholine, if you do not isolate one of the limbs using the BP cuff, the person may be completely paralyzed and you may not notice any seizure, particularly if you do not have EEG monitoring. Why right forearm or leg? It is because if you are giving right unilateral ECT, you should make sure that seizure is actually helpful only if it is generalized to the left side as well. So if the seizure has to generalize to the left side, you should be able to observe the motor seizures on the right side. Hence, you should be careful to tie the cuff on the right forearm or the leg in case of right unilateral ECT. If you are using bilateral ECTs, it doesn't matter which side of the limb, which side of the body you tie the BP cuff. Again, check vitals. Pre-oxygenate with about 100% oxygen for some time. Then inject the anesthetic agent as per the dose decided by the anesthetist. Now inflate the cuff beyond the systolic BP. Now confirm that the patient is deeply sedated. One of the methods is to ask the person to count, and the person will slowly stop counting. You know that the person is sedated. I think this is the best method. You can also look for palpebral reflex or corneal reflex. In my opinion, asking the person to count, etc., will be easier and more reliable method of doing it. Then inject succinylcholine. As soon as you give succinylcholine, you will observe fasciculations. You wait till the fasciculations end and the person is completely relaxed. It is then, during this process, you keep continuous positive pressure ventilation with 100% oxygen. After you confirm the complete relaxation, place the bite block so that the person will not injure his tongue or cheek. Then they apply the ECT electrodes, deliver the charge, monitor the EEG and motor seizures, immediately release the cuff, and continue ventilation till spontaneous breathing returns. Clear all the secretions, monitor vitals at regular intervals. Make sure that the patient is steady while sending the patient back to the ward. Briefly about EEG monitoring. In many centers, you may not have ever seen this. It is mandatory in many countries, and I think it's a good practice to use EEG monitoring routinely because it detects prolonged, sometimes inadvertently missed seizures. Sometimes there will be good cerebral seizures but without any motor seizures. You may miss that and you may increase the dose inadvertently, thinking that the person did not have motor seizures or seizures at all. It is relatively inexpensive. It is not rocket science. It's very easy to use EEG. You just have to attach 3 electrodes. This is how typically EEG appears during ECT. There is an early phase which is characterized by rapid polyspike low amplitude waves. It is followed by a mid phase where The waves are slow, about 3 Hz. They're tall and regular. And you may see at the end, there is an abrupt cessation of seizures. And in the post-ictal phase, there is what is called as post-ictal suppression of EEG. Then you know that the EEG the EEG seizures have stopped. Coming to anesthetic agents, thiopentone is the most commonly used barbiturate and anesthetic agent. There is a problem with this particular agent in the sense that the hemodynamic changes with thiopentone are poorly controlled, whereas methotrexate has minimal effect on the seizure, but it has a quick induction and recovery, and its hemodynamic effects are also moderate. Propofol, it decreases seizure threshold if given 1 mg plus, not when it's given say 0.5 mg per kg body weight. And if given in good dose, it also controls the hemodynamic changes well. Then there is etomidate. Coming to ketamine, it does not interfere with seizure induction, and it may help in situations where seizure induction is difficult. But the flip side is that it can cause hypertension, and generally it is in the elderly that we find seizure induction is difficult, and many elderly will have hypertension in the baseline. So using ketamine to avoid to improve seizure induction becomes a little challenging if a person also has hypertension. It is intuitive to believe that ketamine itself is antidepressant, and you add ECT to that, it should have a synergetic effect. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Many RCTs have shown that adding ketamine to ECT does not seem to have any positive effect on the antidepressant action. Sevoflurane is an inhalant anesthetic agent. And of course, the muscle relaxant which is most commonly used is succinylcholine. If in cases where succinylcholine is contraindicated, like we listed a few slides before, curariform drugs like atracurium may be used. Atropine can be given at 0.6 mg intravenously. It need not be used routinely. It is generally given to dry secretions and to prevent bradycardia. It may be useful during the first ECT. Here is the rationale. Now, when you give electrical stimulus to the brain, the first response of the brain is to have bradycardia and sometimes asystole. That will be followed by seizures. When there is seizure, it will lead to adrenaline surge. When there is adrenaline surge, it will overcome the bradycardia and it will create increase in blood pressure as well. What happens during first ECT is that the person, sometimes we assess the seizure threshold during first ECT, and the first stimulus that you may give may not induce seizures. So you end up stimulating the brain with the electrical stimulus, which can cause bradycardia and sometimes asystole, but there is no seizure followed by that to compensate it with adrenaline surge. So the person will be prone to develop bradycardia. So to prevent that during first ECT, you may want to use atropine. And you should also be careful to avoid beta blockers during the first ECT. So instead of atropine, you may use glycopyrrolate as well. Coming to electrode placement, in NIMHANS, most commonly used electrode placement is bifrontal. We give it by placing the electrodes 5 centimeters superior to the outer angle of the orbit on both sides. In the middle picture, you will see the bitemporal placement. You have to measure the distance between the tragus and the outer angle of the eye. Take the midpoint of this line and go about an inch superior on both right and left side. That will become the electrode placement for bitemporal. For the right unilateral, one of the electrodes is the same as bitemporal, that is on the right side, and you take the midpoint of the vertex 1 centimeter to the right or 1 inch to the right, about 3 centimeters to the right is the other electrode. If you use this is also called as the D Ilia position, electrode position for right unilateral ECT. This is how you place the electrode during the different electrode placements. Coming to the electrical aspects of ECT, the earliest devices used to give the electrical stimulus in a sine wave. And at the peak of the sine wave, the neurons would get action potential. It's only at the peak that there will be action potential. That means only this portion is required. The raising and falling ends of the sine wave would just give additional electricity to the brain, which is of no use. So people thought we should remove that and make the pulse into a square wave or a rectangular wave, which is called as the brief pulse ECT of these years. Now let us learn the parts of the electrical stimulus. You can see that you have depicted one train of ECT stimulus here. It has positive and negative pulses. One pair of positive and negative pulses make a cycle. In one pulse, the vertical distance is a measure of current, which is generally about 800 milliamperes. It is measured in amperes and milliamperes. The width of a pulse is called the pulse width, generally about 0.3 to 1.5 to 2 milliseconds. Pulse frequency is how many number of pulses are given in a second. You can also measure that as frequency of cycles or hertz. And the total number of pulses that a person receives during a stimulus will be measured using the duration of the train, which lasts for about 0.5 to about 3 to 4 seconds in most cases. How to calculate charge? You know from physics that current is equal to voltage divided by the resistance. Now most devices that we use are constant current stimulus devices. What these devices do is they adjust the voltage to keep the current constant across the changing resistance. So as you see throughout the cycle, you will have the amplitude of all these pulses equal. That is the meaning of constant current pulses. Now charge is equal to current into time. Okay, in other words, current is charge per time. So so the charge is equal to current into time. Now current, you said, we just now discussed that it's constant. Now what is the time? Time for the current, the time for which the current flows through a person's head will be measured by looking at the on phases of these pulses. Okay, the time is equal to pulse width into the number of pulses. The current flows here, then there is a gap, then some more current comes, there is a gap, some more current comes, there is a gap, some more current comes, like this. So pulse width into number of pulses gives you the time. The number of pulses is equal to pulses per second into the total time duration. So that will give you the total number of pulses. Now total number of pulses into pulse width gives you the total time, and the charge is equal to current into pulse width, into pulse per seconds, into train duration. I'll tell you by giving an example. Suppose the current is 0.8 milliamperes. The pulse width is 1 millisecond. Now number of pulses is about 100. The duration of the train is about 1 second. Then the charge is equal to 0.8 into 1 into 100 into 1, that is 80 millicoulombs. In the recent years, there is a lot of talk about ultra brief pulse ECT. This is the rationale for that. The optimal pulse width required to elicit an action potential is about 1.1 to 0.2 milliseconds. Hence, anything more than this may not have any advantage. The brief pulse has pulse width between 0.5 to 1.5 milliseconds, and ultra brief pulse has a pulse width of less than or equal to 0.3 milliseconds. So unilateral brief pulse, ultra brief pulse ECT seems to have cognitive advantage. By RCTs we know that, but it is not well studied in bilateral ECTs, or when it has been studied, it has not been found to be useful, and in conditions other than depression. So it has not been well studied in conditions other than depression. This is the left-sided figure shows you the brief pulse stimulus, and the right-sided one shows you the ultra brief pulse stimulus. You can see that both are about 1 second duration. Here the pulse width is broader, here the pulse width is smaller, and the frequency is the same. Instead of pulse width, you can also vary pulse frequency. So again, the same duration of train, more number of pulses, that is about 100 pulses per second, would look something like this. If you give less number of pulses, about 75 pulses per second, you can still give the ECT by giving pulses less frequently. Overall, it has been found that if the pulse width is reduced and pulse frequency is reduced, less charge will be required to induce seizures. This principle can be made use of if you have challenging case where you cannot induce seizures with your regular ECT pulses. How will you decide on the dosage of stimulus? So as we learned, charge can be varied by varying any of these parameters. Most commonly used method is, or most recommended method is titration method, where the first ECT is given starting from the low charge, keep giving higher and higher charges till the person gets a seizure. The lowest charge at which the seizure is elicited is called the threshold, and subsequent ECT should be given at about 4 to 6 times the threshold if you are giving a unilateral ECT, and 1.5 to 2.5 times the threshold if you are giving bilateral ECTs. People have talked about other methods like formula method, where they put in the age of the person. Sometimes the distance between the nasion and enion is put into the formula. The formula will tell you how much you should use in terms of millicoulombs, and you can use that to induce seizures. Then there is no need for you to titrate. There are some machines which are designed in a way where you have to turn the knob of the ECT machine to the half of the age of the patient, and somewhere it hits the threshold of that person. And sometimes people use what is called as maximum dose method. So you give you administer ECT with the full output of the device. There is some rationale for this, particularly if you are giving ECTs in the elderly and right unilateral. In the elderly, the threshold is higher, and you will have to anyway give 4 to 5 times or 6 times the threshold. Commonly, the person's threshold is in such a way that the full dose or the supra-threshold dose will be equivalent to the maximum dose of the device. Now, why waste one ECT session by just assessing threshold. Why don't you go maximal and start the treatment from the effective treatment from the first session itself? So it has its advantages. Sometimes it may overshoot the person's requirement and it may cause cognitive adverse effects. So depending on the urgency, clinical urgency, and the cognitive uh, concern, you may have to use one of these methods to calculate the charge or the dose of the stimulus. Coming to frequency of sessions, it is generally administered twice or thrice weekly. In depression, the final clinical response is the same with both thrice weekly or twice weekly, but the response rate is faster with thrice weekly in terms of the number of days. In other words, in 2 weeks, you give 6 ECTs if you give thrice weekly, and if you used twice weekly, you would have to wait till 3 weeks to give 6 ECTs. In terms of number of sessions, both will have equal response. But the person who received thrice weekly ECTs will reach there 1 week earlier than the person who received twice weekly. But you should also know that twice weekly is cognitively safer. So the final outcome is equal, cognitively safer. You can go for twice weekly. Again, if you are fraught with a person who is highly suicidal, highly catatonic, etc., I think it is prudent to go for thrice weekly, which gives you a little faster response. There is less research on other indications than depression in terms of frequency of sessions. As I said, the decision to give either twice weekly or thrice weekly should be made based on the clinical situation. That is, need for quick response, thrice weekly; concerned about cognitive effects is twice weekly. How many ECTs to be given? It varies widely across individuals and indications. For depression, about 6 to 12 sessions. Schizophrenia may need more sessions. The rule of thumb is that the ECT may be stopped if there is either remission or plateauing of the effect for 2 consecutive sessions. If you observe that the person has improved initially, but for 2 consecutive sessions there is no further improvement, the person may be symptomatic, but is not receiving any more improvement with ECT in spite of giving 2 consecutive sessions, then you may want to stop ECT at that stage. If there is poor response despite about 6+ sessions, you can consider change of the electrode placement, especially if you are giving right unilateral, you can switch over to bilateral, bifrontal. You can give higher stimulus dose. Maybe you have to reassess the threshold and see what may be an ideal dose for this person. Few lines about continuation and maintenance treatment. Continuation ECT is generally understood to prevent the relapse of symptoms of the current episode. The person has responded to ECT, but if you stop ECT, the symptoms may come back again. So in order to prevent relapses of the same episode, you have to give continuation ECT. Typically, it lasts up to 6 months. Maintenance ECT is when you want to prevent further relapse of fresh episodes. Typically, it is beyond 6 months. There is no fixed regime for either of these. We may start with once a week, then switch over to about once in 10 days or once in fortnight, then once monthly, maybe once in 2 months. You will have to reduce it to the extent that the person can tolerate without relapsing. Close monitoring of cognitive adverse effects is very important because you are doing something very unusual and giving ECTs on many occasions. A last bit about adverse effects during the course of ECT. The adverse events are related to ECT administration, cognitive adverse effects, and other adverse effects. One of the commonest adverse event, or if you want to call it that way, is an absent or a brief seizure. Now, if the seizure is well generalized motor seizure, or if the EEG seizure is of satisfactory morphology, then any duration of seizure can be considered adequate. And we observe that if the seizure has this quality, it generally lasts for about 15 seconds or more than that. The association of duration of seizure and outcome is very inconsistent. One should not believe that longer duration of seizure means better outcome. That has not been found. Re-stimulation may be attempted after 20 seconds if there is brief seizure or an absent seizure. You can give up to 4 or 5 attempts in the same session. One of the reasons why we may have to stop re-attempting is because the person may come out of the succinylcholine effect. Hence, we may abort re-attempting, and because the person may end up getting unmodified ECTs later. The absent or brief seizures are common in elderly patients and in people who are on antiepileptics. The following procedures may be useful. You should ensure that the contact between the electrode and scalp is good, particularly if you are giving bitemporal ECTs or unilateral ECTs where both ECT electrodes may be on hairy area and the person has very thick hair, and especially women who have long hair, you may have poor contact between the electrode and scalp. That you should first make sure that mistake you are not doing. You revise the decision to continue antiepileptics and benzodiazepines. Vigorous hyperventilation, you request the anesthetist to help you with this before stimulus application. EEG monitoring, you may find sometimes the EEG seizures may be very good, only motor seizures are not there. You should consider the reduction of pulse frequency and pulse width. As I said, if you reduce pulse frequency and pulse width, the efficiency of seizure generation goes up. Consider reduction of frequency of sessions from say thrice weekly to twice weekly, or once in about a week's time, once in 6 days, something like that you can do. You can change the type or dose of anesthetic agents. Particularly, you can see whether you can give ketamine or one of the opioid anesthetic agent along with one of the barbiturate anesthetic agents also can be given. The role of flumazenil and theophylline are doubtful. Some of these may be useful if the person is on very high dose of benzodiazepine or antiepileptics, but they are known to prolong the seizure, but they are not known to reduce the threshold. Prolonged seizures are another complications. Definitions differ, but anywhere between more than 120 to 180 seconds can be called as prolonged seizures. It's common in youth and during the first ECT session. Prolonged seizure may be associated with cognitive deficits, hence it is to be aborted. Hence, EEG monitoring is particularly advised if you are giving ECT to children, adolescents, and young adults. It may be terminated using benzodiazepines or thiopentone. The person has hyponatremia or higher levels of serum levels of lithium, you should look for, because these two they cause prolonged seizures many times. And reduction of stimulus intensity may not help. Some of you may think that, okay, if he is getting prolonged seizure with say 180 millicoulombs, so next time I should give him 120. So it may not work that way. The person either may not get any seizure at all, or even if it does, you may not be able to prevent prolonged seizure in that situation. Post-ECT confusion is another uncommon side effect. Disorientation, confusion, agitation lasting for a few minutes and sometimes lasting for 1 or 2 hours can also be there. What is very typical of this behavior is that if you restrain the person, it worsens the situation. But you cannot prevent yourself from restraining as well. Sometimes the person can be very dangerous to himself or others. So aborting this with haloperidol or benzodiazepines may be considered. It is generally associated with lithium or use of some antibiotics like ciprofloxacin. It may recur with each treatment session in some individuals. Sometimes we have used haloperidol preemptively. As soon as the seizure is over, we have given haloperidol to prevent the person from getting agitated. Cognitive adverse effects can be subjective or objective. Subjective adverse effects are commonly reported. There is generally poor association between what the person complains and the objective measures. it is more closely associated with the level of depression rather than the ECT per se. Coming to objective measures of cognitive adverse effects, you can broadly classify them as memory and non-memory, and in memory, anterograde and retrograde. If anybody interested in knowing more about cognitive adverse effects should read this very good systematic review which appeared in Biological Psychiatry in 2010. In this table, you can see a list of cognitive tests that were done. The red ones are statistically significant. A symbol minus indicates that ECT worsened cognition. And if the figure is positive, it means ECT improved cognition. You can notice that from 0 to 3 days after last ECT, people's cognition was quite compromised across several tests of cognition. But you can also notice that after about between 4 to 15 days of time, many cognitive tests were within the normal range or improved range. And except period associate learning, that is a measure of delayed recall, which was still affected by ECT. And after 15 days, nearly none were continuing to be affected. Here are a few more cognitive tests which tell you the same story. In summary, most cognitive domains showed significant worsening only during the first 3 days. Nearly all improved within 15 days. Most were significantly better after ECT, and none was worse than pre-ECTs by 15 days. There is an important caveat for this systematic review. That is, retrospective memory was not included in this because of reasons of there being no baseline data or test not being standardized. Now, autobiographical memory loss may be important for patients, and this was not measured in this systematic review. So the jury is still out on whether people can have permanent autobiographical memory loss, if not permanent, lasting autobiographical memory impairment there or not, and it is very important for the person. So, and it included only patients with depression, so we don't know about other conditions. In EMHANS, we use what is called as battery for ECT related cognitive deficits before ECT recode. It has both subjective and objective elements. If the person is very, very not cooperative, you can use just the subjective measure. You can measure retrograde and anterograde memory using this battery. Verbal and visual memory will be covered. Orientation through HMSC items. Sustained attention and psychomotor speed will be measured, and working memory will be measured. Sorry for the spelling error there. So it is validated in the Indian context. It takes about 20 to 25 minutes to administer. It is ideally done at baseline and after 3rd, 6th, and 9th ECT. So individual domains are important. There is nothing called total score of before ECT recode. It doesn't make sense to total the score. It is very helpful to make clinical decisions. Like, for example, the person has not improved with ECT, but has no cognitive deficits as well. You can take some risk and give more ECTs. The person is improving within 2-3 ECTs, but lot of cognitive impairment. You can take a decision to either space out ECTs or stop ECTs. So this tool is helpful to make clinical decisions. And if you are giving a person ECT as a profound treatment as ECT, I think it is prudent on our part to spend some time, about 15-20 minutes in a week, to assess the person's cognitive adverse effects. Other adverse effects are headache, myalgia, vomiting, and tardive seizures. Tardive seizures are seizures that occur after the ECT-induced seizures have stopped completely. Sometimes people are shifted to the ward, and in the ward they may get seizures, sometimes associated with clozapine plus ECT. To learn about serious cognitive adverse effects and using special precautions during ECT, we will have a separate session. You can await for that session. I end my session here today. If you have questions, you can ask me now.
Thank you, Dr. Jagdish sir, for the lucid presentation. Now, if anybody has doubts, they can ping us through chat. There are questions. Sir, please explain the electrical part again.
So this is the morphology of electrical stimulus. It has pulses, positive and negative pulses. In between there is no electricity. It gives in burst pulses. Okay. So suppose there is a positive pulse. It has a few milliseconds of pulse width. The amplitude of the pulse is measured in milliamperes. Okay. Now you two pulses will make out a two pulse, one positive and one negative pulse will make what is called as a cycle. Now the total duration of train can last for about, let's say, 1 second. Within 1 second, if you give 100 pulses per second, 100 such pulses will be given. 50 positive and 50 negative pulses will be given. Each will be identical. So in order to calculate the charge, you have to multiply the current, that is 0.8 milliamperes, for example. Let's say the pulse width is 1 milliseconds. And if you are giving 100 pulses and the duration of the electricity is for 1 second, you multiply all these, you will get 80 millicoulombs. That's how you calculate the charge. I hope it is clear. We have sent them the ECT manual. So the ECT administration manual is there. You can spend some time. You can use some permutations and combinations of these various parameters and calculate the charge for yourself. There is one example, I think, given in the ECT administration manual as well. My suggestion is that you meet as a group and discuss some of these things, and then you may get a better idea. If you still have questions, I think we will take it up during the next ECT presentation.
So there are a few more questions. Can ECT be given in children? Similarly, can ECT be given in IDD patients?
Yes, ECT can be given in children. Even in the Mental Health Care Act, it is there. But under the Mental Health Care Act, it says that the permission from the Mental Health Review Board must be obtained before giving ECT to children defined as less than 18 years of age. In NIMHANS, I think we give ECTs to children on an average about 1 per month, about 10 to 15 in a year, particularly adolescents. People with IDD, yes, the person, if the indication is clear, the indication for ECT in IDD is the same as indication in people who have normal IQ otherwise. So if the indication is there, like severe depression, severe agitation due to mania, schizophrenia, catatonia, yes, you can give ECT to people with IDD as well.
Thank you, sir. Can you re-explain the dose calculation of ECT?
My suggestion is that I will do it, but not today. So please, the slides will be there with you.
It will be, the recorded video will be posted in YouTube and the link will be circulated.
Okay. So it's very simple. So please spend some time. Maybe you will not be able to grasp it in one go. I'm assuring you that I will explain to you again in the next class if you are still not understood.
A few more questions, sir. Number of sessions in schizophrenia and mania to be given.
Number of sessions.
Sessions.
Okay. Number of sessions for schizophrenia, is generally more than that with depression. Okay. Now, it also depends on why you give ECT in schizophrenia. If you are giving ECT to a person with treatment-resistant schizophrenia, particularly clozapine-resistant schizophrenia, the person may require more number of ECTs. You may not want to stop the trial of ECTs before you reach about 10, 12, or even 15 ECTs with resistant schizophrenia. But if you are giving ECT to a person with catatonic schizophrenia, or a person with schizophrenia who has come to you with acute depression and suicidality and inanition, etc., then even less number of ECTs may suffice. We may not decide on the number of ECTs based on the diagnosis. It is mostly dependent on the indication. Suppose suicidality is your indication, and the person's suicidality drops to, let's say, 0, then you may stop ECTs. Or if your target is catatonia, and the catatonia rating scale shows that the person does not have any features of catatonia, then you may stop there. So there is no fixed numbers. I think we should go by clinical wisdom, adverse effects, complications, and as I said, there is a rule of thumb, which is after initial improvement, if there is no more improvement on 2 consecutive ECTs, you may stop ECTs.
What about
the same applies to mania as well. Generally, mania requires a slightly lesser number of ECTs than schizophrenia.
Should ECT be stopped directly or tapered off? Is there a chance of rebound symptoms of psychosis?
Again, depends. If you are giving ECT for a person with treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and the person has responded, in the first place, you are given ECT because he was not responding to the medications. So once you stop ECTs, the person will be again on the same medicine which did not help him. So there is a theoretical chance that he may relapse, unless you have drastically changed his medications. If I suppose that you would have tried that before you would have given ECTs. So there is a chance of relapse is high if you are given ECT to people with resistant schizophrenia or resistant depression as well. So in such cases, it is prudent to gradually taper, and instead of, I may say, stop, to reduce the number of reduce the frequency of ECTs to as less as possible, like once in 2 months, once in 3 months, you may want to give. So in other words, there is the risk of relapse is high if there is treatment resistance. But if there is no treatment resistance, then you may stop ECT abruptly. There is no problem. Like, for example, you have admitted a person with acute suicidality in the context of severe depression. You have started antidepressants, but you cannot wait. Then you start ECTs. By the time ECTs are over, the antidepressants might have taken care of the depression. So in such cases, you can stop ECTs abruptly.
Should we always prophylactically stop valproate, benzodiazepines, etc. before ECT, or should we stop them if there is difficulty with the seizures?
Yes, good question. I think this will be answered in a future class as well. But in general, if the antiepileptics are not given for epilepsy, we may stop or need not stop. Okay, if it is given for epilepsy, we should not stop. If it is given for bipolar disorder or any other mood episodes, we can take a decision to stop or not stop. Your first approach could be to not stop, not even skip the dose, not even reduce the dose. Give ECTs when the person is on full dose of antiepileptics. Only if you find that seizures are not difficult to elicit, then you may reduce or even stop antiepileptics. We have conducted an RCT where we have found that compared to stopping antiepileptics or even half antiepileptics being given in half dose. If you give full dose, that has the best response. Though the threshold was high, we had to give higher charge, but you should keep in mind that cognitive adverse effects are not dependent on the charge. Cognitive adverse effects are dependent on the how many folds the threshold you have increased the stimulus dosage. Since you are measuring threshold for all people with antiepileptics at different doses, the amount of charge that you will give will be still about 1.5 or 2.5 times the threshold level. So the charge may be higher, but it is equivalent to giving 1.5 times the threshold. So it is best to continue antiepileptics and give ECT only if the seizure is difficult to elicit. You can stop. It is also challenging to stop antiepileptics. What happens sometimes is that you want to stop antiepileptics because you want to give ECT. Now you stop antiepileptics, give ECT, the person is better. Now you stop ECT and start antiepileptics. To build up antiepileptic dose and for the serum level to reach, there will be some time. By that time, sometimes patients relapse. So you should avoid that. Okay, so this is the practice that I suggest, but I think the recommendations are very vague in this regard. The practice in NIMHANS is to continue antiepileptics during ECT.
That also answers the next question.
Yes.
And is there a chance that a patient can switch from depression to mania? And what should be done? Should we continue ECT or not in such a?
Yeah, there is a chance for patients, particularly people with bipolar disorder, they can switch to hypomania, mania during ECT. ECT works for mania as well. So the best approach is to continue ECT even if the person develops mania, because it will control mania as well. Sometimes the ECT induced confusion can look like mania. In that case, you should be careful. The person is manic but cognitively uncompromised, then you can continue ECTs. You can add mood stabilizers, you can add antipsychotics in addition to ECT. But if the person has significant cognitive impairment and has developed some affective symptoms, it may be a variant of some ECT induced confusion. So then you should not continue ECT.
Is there any specific electrode placement method for unilateral ECTs in affective disorder versus psychosis?
No. It is the same for both. You should know that there is hardly any literature on unilateral ECT in indications other than depression. There are one or two papers from our center only which showed not much of a difference between bilateral and unilateral ECTs.
There are also questions on lithium. Probably it will be taken up in future classes. Should lithium be stopped prior to ECTs? And
my response is the same. Okay, I think I will answer this here itself. Similar to antiepileptics, there are practical difficulties in stopping and starting lithium. So lithium, in which conditions you will come across lithium and ECT? Either the person is on lithium or prophylaxis, then he gets a breakthrough episode, let's say depression or mania. Then you have to give. Or you have started the person on lithium, the person has not still responded, and then you have to give ECT. These are two common reasons why you may have to come across this kind of combination. Now what happens if you stop lithium because of the reason you have to give ECT? The person may respond to ECT and then may relapse by the time you restart lithium and go up to the levels. But as I said, lithium can be associated with post-ictal delirium, prolonged seizures, prolonged apnea, and significant cognitive impairment. So what you should do is to make sure that lithium is at the lower end of serum levels, say 0.6 to 0.8. Don't give ECT when the serum levels are 0.8 plus. Secondly, if the person is aged and is on multiple other medications, then it may be better to avoid lithium and ECT combination, either give lithium alone or give ECT alone. But in most people who are young, otherwise medically stable, you can continue with lithium as long as the serum levels are at the lower end. Generally nothing happens, but if you do observe cognitive impairment, you can revise the strategy.
Common causes for prolonged seizures, and can we give ECT for such patients in future? What charge of current needs to be given?
Young people, first ECT are the most common physiological causes of prolonged seizures. Pathological causes are generally hyponatremia, being on lithium, or a person who is otherwise neurologically compromised, let's say person with epilepsy. These people may have prolonged seizures. So paradoxically, what happens is if you increase the stimulus dose, instead of increasing the seizure duration, the duration may remain the same or even come down. So you can give ECTs even if the person has prolonged seizure. Be ready to abort the seizure using either benzodiazepine or thiopentone. If the person has hyponatremia, correct, keep the lithium, either stop the lithium or keep it at a lower end of seizure serum level, and you can go on with ECTs even if the prolonged seizures are there. But as long as you, I also advise that you use EEG monitoring and abort it as early as it is possible.
Which lead placement has maximum efficacy, and which one of it has least cognitive adverse effect?
Least cognitive adverse effects is right unilateral. Best efficacy seems to be bifrontal ECT. There is always a trade-off. If you come from unilateral to bifrontal, you will have to compromise on cognitive safety and you will gain more clinical efficacy. In my opinion, bifrontal seems to have the best balance between cognitive safety and speed of response.
For a patient being considered for ECT with a concomitant history of chronic alcoholism, what measures should be taken?
Can you repeat it, Chetan?
For a patient being considered for ECT with concomitant history of chronic alcoholism, what measures need to be taken?
Yeah, I think a lot of things have to. If the person is in withdrawal state and all, I don't think I will venture into ECT. I'm assuming that the person does not have active alcohol use or not in acute withdrawal phase. And in only such cases, I would give ECT. Since the anesthetic agents are metabolized through liver, liver function should be all right. If liver functions are all right, if hemogram is normal, no medical comorbidities, then I think the person with alcohol problem and person without alcohol problem will stand the equal chance of improving or not improving or having adverse effects due to ECT.
There is question on pregnancy and ECT. Can it be given?
It will be taken in the next class.
We have come to the end of today's session, the first class of non-invasive brain stimulation. Every first Saturday of every month would be a class on non-invasive brain stimulation, as is every last Saturday of every month would be on forensic psychiatry. We'll also communicate on future classes to you in the both WhatsApp group and Telegram group. The video of this, the recorded video of this will be edited and will be posted in YouTube, and the link will be shared with you all. Thank you for participating in today's discussion. Today's discussion and in generally the Indians is bought by the support through educational grant from Linux Laboratories, Chennai. Thank you one and all. Thank you for participating.